European macro region, Central and Eastern Europe, we call the post-socialist countries between Germany, Turkey, and Russia. There are many. We have a research group in border studies headed by James Scott 10 years ago, and that's why I'm here, because it's a very interesting period, bordering, rebordering, and debordering also in my macro region. Thanks for the Hungarian Academy and government for the supportation, because it's very hard to travel to another continent. So, my co-author, Zoltán Gál, is a professor in the university and also a senior researcher in our institute. And we have some manuscripts and joint publication about this region and the development and the reorganization of Central and Eastern Europe in a geo-economic perspective. We have a special issue edited by James in the last issue of Eurasian Geography and Economics about these geographical imaginations. And we try to put in the next issue these economic dependencies, economic bordering of the region. We deal with this phenomenon with 5 or 6 years ago. So this Ukrainian war, it's underlined. There is a very specific problem. We have dependencies, not only German foreign direct investment, also with the Russian transmission of energies. We can separate geopolitics and geoeconomics, but the base is the economic and geographical elements, and the goal is to achieve geopolitical benefits for the goals with this asymmetric interdependence or power relations. And 2 decades ago, when the new member states still came to rejoin Western Europe, somebody want to underline there is a new central periphery relationship rebuilt. Why? Because some big companies push the factories through the state borders, but they root these factories. These are not joint ventures, 100% Western European capital they have. So that's why they rebordering this region. It's a fortunate being nearer to Germany, because Germany is the factory and the engine of the European Union. But we saw that there are new bordering patterns. We can get the European structural funds and also FDI, but there are outflows such as the profit and also the huge out-migration of the people, and also some indirect outflows because motorways and railways always built by Austrian and German capital. The main dominated companies. So the first global financial and economic crisis after we joined the EU underline these weaknesses. The model has a problem because we are not developing countries and not developed countries. We are transition countries now also, and FDI not also gives only benefits. And there is a dual economy in these countries with very huge and strong independence of dependence in foreign capital, foreign companies, and very weak endogenous for national owned and also mid-sized companies. And that's why it's not a solution. It's a specific model. We have some other interpretations on this region, this East-West divide. We can also know it in the academic sphere, not only this Anglo-Saxon hegemony and the language problems, also this neoliberal problems, which give us the globalization, but it's another, but not only center-periphery relationship. We can't overgeneralize this theory because it's not an Asian convergence. It's another one because we have no resources, only the low wages, not oil and other minerals. So there are new theories came from politicians or human social science researchers. The first was the dependent market economies, because there is a dependency from the foreign owned companies. But the COVID era shows that they also dependent because of these value changes from Eastern Europe. The parts, elements, they can produce without these parts because they optimize the just-in-time process in the Schengen zone or near to the Schengen zone. And there are historically path dependence problems. It's a very specific macro region. The past 3 decades, we saw significant changes, fundamentally from the state socialism to dependent market economies. And in several cases, the Socialist Republic of Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia became dissolution, and there are many and small countries with new state structure, new state territory, new neighborhood. So this very dynamic period ruled by this globalization and metropolization, the development of capital cities and maybe the neighborhood region of the European Union. That's why territorial disparities within the countries are increased. We have very negative democratic trends till the 18th, but after we joined the EU, there was a mass out migration to Western Europe. So that is the problem, and the politicians after 2 decades, revisited this development strategy. Somebody wants to diversify it by Chinese and other Asian or Middle East capitals. And there is a revenge of the places. You can see the voting in the rural regions. It's the opposite of the capital cities and the big cities also here. It's a huge table. How can we interpret these small countries? They turn from the western part of East to the eastern part of West. And if you look at the green numbers, transition and development in the global point of view is successful because from the Social Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, from Czechoslovakia, from Serbia, they became the member of the EU, the member of the NATO, and these are small countries, small population, not a big problem to get in the European Union, and with very high development level. So from this point of view, we are a successful macro region. Despite of the demographic trends, we are lose the population for 40 years ago. The capital cities are in the map in the newest ranking of global cities, which based on the concentration of advanced producer services. We can see the capital cities are in the maps, but not in the high level. London and New York are alpha plus, but this is the same that we can see in Asia, except Beijing and Shanghai, without population, without extensive urbanization. It's very interesting how the Western capital spread. But we can see that the increase of this globalization is territorially unbalanced because many regions are now avoided by FDI. Historically, there is a bordering concept of this Central and Eastern European region, or Middle Europe, Mid Europe. There are many phrases. How can we interpret this? Gregor Gorzelak said that after the Iron Curtain has collapsed, there is a new and golden curtain became between the new member states and the eastern or southern neighbors. And this is not good because the European Union cannot spread to east and to south. And there are many phrases to catch this gateways or zone, buffer zone, borderland of former empire. Sorry, it is traditionally a German sphere, not the Russian one. But in several times we got in contact with the Russian army, so we have the historical knowledge on this. Mittel-Europa, mid of Europe. So there are many concepts and strategies historically economic, political, or geopolitical and geo-economic one. Fortunately, we are the nearest countries, and that's why it's not an offshore, a near shore home of the German manufacturing. Yeah, they have benefits here, and I think this region really contribute to the German and to the European competitiveness. You can see these 14 countries investigated. There are many different groups. The biggest is Poland. Here you can see the top 10 companies by the total revenue. The small countries have small, big companies. And if we investigate the shareholders who are who's the owner of these companies, and we aggregate the 10 top companies shareholders, we can see 4 groups. There are small countries and with the other different privatization politically. They run another route in Poland. They own more than 50% the top 10 companies. There are in between some. The green is the homeland capital, and there are some countries who sell the former state-owned company or invite big motor factories, and you can see Bulgaria, Slovakia, Hungary, and also Kosovo. Thanks, James. We have less than a quarter of the shareholders in these big companies. So I skip these new interpretations, only you can read how many words we can use to describe these programs process. And it's very interesting because Poland and Hungary at the same time colonies and colonizers, because the Hungarian biggest bank, OTP, and the biggest oil company, MOL, has more than 20 countries, branches, and dominate the Central and Eastern European or the Southeast European energy and bank system, then from 50%. Yeah, we have the largest motor factory in Győr, produced 2 million engines to Volkswagen and Audi. So that is a new post-colonialism. It's an FDI-led strategy, but we have programs, dependencies. And in the long term, my co-author, Gál professor, can show, based on the Madison database, that the increasing gap, we are also far from the Western European countries. Here you can see the most developed Western European 12 countries, and the red line is Southeast Europe or Balkans, and the green one is the Visegrad 4 countries. So we always have transitional problems, and this gap we traditionally had. So this catching up is very difficult. We can see here the bordering based on the GDP per capita focused to the state border, and we can see also the reconstruction after the war, Bosnia-Herzegovina, also the Ukrainian war, this GDP gap. But we can also see that the map is more warmer, so everybody goes in a higher level, but the gaps still remain. You can see also the problem of the Greek economy. So they can move down in this competition. So I skip this. Okay, and these are the conclusions, only 1 minute. So this is an FDI dependent capitalism. We can't generally thought everything about 14 countries, but the external capital is the problem historically, and the lagging behind of the dynamics, because they don't want to innovate in these countries. So we can do only the lower economic processes. And there are very discontent and bordering in the regions, in the countries, between the urban system. And that's why rising populism, post-crisis movements, and this migration from the rural area to big cities, to capital cities, to Western Europe. So I think it's generally a problem of lagging behind countries, but we are mostly in the European Union, and in the European Union we have to see this whole cohesion, and we have to sell money to do not lagging behind regions, and don't let people this post-colonialism situation. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Sila. That's a lot of information in there, and a lot of very contentious information, but we can discuss that later. I would like to proceed. I think I'm going to make sure that Niru Hassan is not here. So, so the next speaker is Melika. Yes. I invite you to give your talk on the dialectical relation of historical capitalism and the concept of border identity. So, kind of continuing this conversation of economic bordering and kind of a historical perspective.
Thank you very much for attending to listen to us. In this presentation, I'm going to be talking about what system theory and its relations to nation-states border and border identity formation in general, and give an example from my field work to make a connection between historical capitalism as a general perspective and the Kurdish social transformation as the ethnic groups they live in the borderlands between Iran and Turkey. So, as you know, system analysis has been studied many social scientists like Samir Amin, André Gundar Frank, Paul Baran, and Immanuel Wallerstein to explore global economy as a whole. But in this presentation, I'm follow Wallerstein's perspective to explain and which says to explain the capitalist system from very comprehensive perspective. And Wallerstein, who's an American social scientist, developed system analysis by modifying structural and dependency theory from Marxist critical perspective. He has done lots of works on system analysis, which says there is only one word connected by a network of complex economic exchange relationship. So for him, according to him, world economy is an intersocietal system which has a self-contained division of labor and came into existence in a particular region of the world, the parts of the Europe and America, expanded and developed to englobe whole regions, whole world in a subsequent century. So the global economy constitutes one historical system that's an intersocietal, both historical and societal. So, and in which many modern institutions has been created. Capitalist world economy is based to drive accumulate capital and political conditioning of price level and steep polarizations of social classes and on regions over time, and the characteristics of capitalist system that related to why we need the border formations in the global economy as follows: the endless accumulation for maximization of profits, geographical expansion, deepen and widen surplus extraction, and to keep this system work, a mythical construction of people and territory. So this brief overview of the features of global capitalism show us to how international order works together and stable. So the development of capitalist world economy has involved the creation of the major institution of modern world, like ethnic and national groups and households, social classes and states. So for Wallerstein, all of these institutions are the consequences of the global economy, but not causes. And that's the very important point to make relation border construction. So from Wallerstein perspective, historical capitalism is a key unit of analysis, and in which all social structures and processes should be analyzed together. And following this point of view, there is a dual research agenda we need to follow. The first is how the process of system affect the internal dynamics and the social structure of its components. And the second is how the changes in its components affect the entire system. And these are the ways, so discuss the world system from macro perspective, but rather singular every nation states. So within this context, expanding our region to take capital accumulation originates the process of incorporation into regions into capitalist economy, and that ends up major transformation depending on internal dynamics of different regions, but eventually this integration makes the regions less different from each other. So incorporated areas and peoples often experience profound effects from incorporation and occasionally devastating ones. So even the extent of incorporation into capitalist economy was very limited. At the time of the rise and full expansion of capitalist world economy, nation states are fully developed. So within a capitalist economy, nation states is an institution whose existence is defined by its relation to other states. So this differential strength of multiple states within system is crucial to maintain global economy as a whole. So because the strong states reinforce and increase the differential flows of surplus to the core states by exploiting the other regions of the world. So for Wallerstein, nation states are variable elements and within this system, and its boundaries is clearly defined almost everywhere. So its real power to control the flows of capital, commodities, and labor across its boundaries keeps the global economy works and stable. So that is the why within the capitalist world economy, nation states are sovereign forces to dominate and control demarcated lands. The functioning of capitalist economy is made possible by a network of interrelated sovereign states that have clearly defined by territorial borders. So it's the fact that the states of capitalist war economy exist within the framework of interrelated system, and that states are modern nation state distinguished from other bureaucratic policies throughout the history. So the historical development of capitalist war economy that needs more and more states operating within interstate system have been created. So this is not to say that all nation states are strong and big. There has been at all moments such of a power hierarchy of such states constructed. So fixed border around the world, the mark a politically and officially negotiated to the limit of state sovereignty, which is typically surrounded by a zone of interaction. So in this system, if we move on the ideological belief in capitalist economy, nationalism as it had taken shape in 19th century, so project national independence as a process of creating larger and more progressive state forms. So for Wallerstein, nationalism is an ideology to ensure domination and control people and land during the incorporation of these regions into capitalist economy. And centralization of nation states over territory to establish borders and to force unity on the territory it controls arises homogeneity and heterogeneity, including integration and resistance in terms of culture. From a global perspective mentioned so far, looking at the border zones more closely, there are broad zones with considerable internal differentiation, both spatially and temporally constructed. These areas are often the zones of contact between people with different ways of living, and the larger diverse things encounter each other along the border can be people, products, commodities, and border practices, and even ideologies. So in this connection, the process of incorporation and its roots are the main external factors that create, transform, and destroy the border zones. So these regions have developed very complex culture of their own, and their populations have multi-layered identities to bridge these zones of liminality, and including both of creation and destruction as well. Yeah, in this context, what is significant is the perception of differences between the communities introduced by political border. And national identity is a socially constructed and a continuous process of defining friend and enemy. And this othering process is maintained boundaries between people like us and them. So living in the local communities living in the borderlands. So taking nation states border and border identity formation on the basis of contradictory viewpoints and enable us to scholarly discussion these concepts in a material context. So following these interpretations, the process of othering is rarely as linear, and rather othering involves a host of concomitant processes that work together to produce economically and culturally differentiated regions. So merger into capitalist economy creates many borderless regions, and some border and borderlands is clearly defined by physical geographic elements, but some border and border regions are understood as ethnic marginality, and sometimes it's called frontier ethnic. So on these regions, the appearance of national identity and the evolution of local society are the process that run parallel together, So to the definition of political borders of national territory, but the most important thing, process, mechanism, and timing of the appearance of national identity is differentiated significantly. So this duality, this dual situation creates paradox of sense of belonging in the border regions, and the dramatic transformation of local society living in the borderlands is not simply as a result of the forces imposed on them by political centers. It's also the process of incorporation these regions into capitalist economy, and which had begun for a long time ago. So that was a brief overview. Yeah, that was a brief overview of the capitalist war economy and its functioning mechanism to make global economy stable, and why political border has to be drawn in global economy. So considering this big picture, and I have been doing my field research in the border regions between Iran and Turkey, and as you can see, so there is an historical border between Iran and Turkey, and that is 534 kilometers in length and has 3 crossings, and which is called Bazargan. This is Razi, and this is the place, and I am conducting my field work, and this is the Sero. So this border regions is populated mostly by Kurds living on the both sides. So since the long 16th century, capitalist war economy has always expanded unevenly over the Middle East regions, including Turkey and Iran. So, and most drastic social changes have brought about the political and economical developments by incorporation of these regions into capitalist economy. So from 16th and 19th century, the border geography and in which the Kurds inhabited densely and had conditions make them into buffer zones between Persian and Ottoman Empire. And in 1932, with a small modification, border had been clearly and officially defined, and the Kurds remained into the two nation states area. Two nation states area as a majority ethnic groups in the borderlands. So this is the border gate. This is from the middle border gate, and in which I am doing my field research. And at this point, border regions as a zones of transition, and we can see the dialects culture transformation, sometimes cultural continuity, and this continuity is happening. And and that's the photos, and for me, very representative photos I got from the borderlands on the two sides during my fieldwork last summer. And the one side is the Iranian side, the other is Turkish side, and the homeowners are Kurds and belonging to same tribe, which is a social organization and among the Kurds in the borderlands. And as you can see, this is the picture of Imam Ali, which is a very important element in the Iranian nation state identity, and not even just after the revolution, and it dates back very, very long time ago. And the other is the Turkish flag, and this is the very important elements as other countries. So they are the Kurds, and they are same family, they share same culture, but they live in the different nation states borders. So the thing is, with the Kurdish states, I would like to draw attention to the central role of the uneven capitalist economy incorporation, this system over the region, and that emerged a set of complex identity formation. So we cannot say that all Kurds abandon their own ethnocultural identity, but this is the things I want to emphasize on. They are not the same as each other, and because of the living in different countries. And then the question is, how similar are they to each other, even though they are the citizens of different countries in the capitalist economy? Thank you.
Okay, so you're right in the middle of your field work and your research, so this is kind of a progress. Good. Thank you very much. Very stimulating. Captivating stuff. Okay, so again, I would ask then, Chris, you're going to be doing this.
It is going to be doing most of this.
Oh, okay. So teaming up here, and we're going to switch to a completely different context. The U.S.-Mexico economic relationship. Here again, I mean, Sila was talking about the automotive sector, and the powerhouse of automotive manufacturing is shifted eastward in the European Union, and it's squarely located in Hungary, Slovakia, Czech Republic, partly Romania. And it's also a motor of development here on the U.S.-Mexican border, and a creator of a lot of these inequalities as well. So enhanced USMCA, I don't know what that is, but you'll explain.
Yes.
Rules of origin provisions for automotive products, implications for Mexico's northern border industrial base. Great, thank you.
Very good. So our topic is on the US-Mexico-Canada agreement. That's what USMCA stands for. And it's on the enhanced rules of origin provisions under that agreement for automotive products, with the emphasis on implications for Mexico's northern border industrial base. So that is in essence the purpose of our paper. What do these new rules of origin mean? And I say new because this started in 2020, so I'll start with that. That's my first sort of section of the paper presentation. I explain the USMCA provisions versus the previous provisions under the North American Free Trade Agreement, the changes, what Mexico's automotive manufacturing industry is all about because it impacts it directly, these changes. And then I'll conclude with final remarks on the prospects for Mexico's automotive manufacturing industry. So in July of 2020, the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, that's the explanation of the acronym, supplanted the North American Free Trade Agreement. This new agreement consists of 34 chapters, 12 side letters, and it's important to say that the USMCA preserved most of NAFTA's chapters, but it did include one notable change in terms of market access provisions for autos to be phased in as of July of this year. So rules of origin provisions, NAFTA versus USMCA. So to qualify for duty-free access, meaning market access, motor vehicles produced in the signatory countries face more stringent rules of origin provisions under the new agreements. First of all, it's a higher threshold of regional value content, and there's newly imposed labor value content, as well as aluminum and steel requirement contents in the products. So here's the contrast between the two. In terms of regional value content, NAFTA imposed 62.5%. The USMCA opted to 75%.
Region means North America.
Yeah, the region is North America, Mexico, United States, Canada. So that regional perspective is those three countries. The labor value content, LVC, there was no requirement under NAFTA. Under the new agreement, 40% labor value content for passenger vehicles, 45% for light trucks to be produced by workers earning at least $16 an hour. Steel, aluminum requirement content, nothing under NAFTA, 70% under the USMCA. Hence the term enhanced, right? So these are more stringent provisions under the new agreement for this particular product category. So in terms of the matter of the 75% regional value content, there's something of particular importance, and it has to do with the following. The USMCA allows automotive producers to determine the RVC of a finished vehicle or truck by relying on any of several calculation methodologies specified in the agreement for calculating that RVC, including what is called the roll-up of originating core parts in the finished vehicle RVC calculation. Those core parts extracted directly from the agreement, you can see it means engines, it means transmissions, and you can see the rest. So those are the core parts that are at issue in terms of this roll-up of originating core parts. Why do I say it's at issue? Because there's actually a dispute between Mexico and Canada on one side and the US on the other in terms of how to interpret that roll-up provision to comply with the 75% RVC. The US provision indicates that RVC calculation and the core parts requirement need to be separate and independent calculations. Bottom line, the finished vehicle has to have RVC of 75%, and the incorporated core parts have to have 75% RVC. Mexico and Canada's interpretation, they are adopting what is allowed, the roll-up of originating core parts in the finished vehicle 75% RVC calculation. So they've argued, therefore, that the US position is not in agreement with Article 3.7 and its relationship with Article 4.5, the roll-up provision of the agreement. So the roll-up does allow the producer to disregard, and I'm in this part, the value of any non-originating inputs used to produce the good when calculating whether the subsequent good, the final good, meets the required RVC threshold. In other words, as long as the final subsequent finished good has that 75% requirement, the core part does not essentially matter. But then Mexico and Canada in this position are essentially saying the US is in violation of the agreement. So because they did try to negotiate and come to an agreement on that interpretation, no agreement was coming forth. The dispute sort of negotiations failed, the consultations failed. So Mexico formally, at the beginning of last year, requested a special panel to resolve the dispute, stating the US adopted an incorrect interpretation of the rules of origin, ROO. On January 13th, Canada joined Mexico, said it agreed with that view. The panel decision was expected in September of last year. It shifted to December of last year, and it was officially announced last month. So what was the panel resolution that was revealed in January? The USMCA panel ruled that the US position on how it was interpreting things was inconsistent with the terms of the agreement, meaning the resolution was in favor of Mexico and Canada. The panel agreed with Mexico and Canada that the US was seeking to impose a requirement beyond the scope of the agreement in that interpretation of the roll-up provision. It was simply inconsistent. Of course, there's a very lengthy explanation that is very much in legal speak in terms of article this, article that, the panel proving that in its inspection, they did determine that the US was actually violating the agreement in how it was choosing to interpret this. Now, what are the implications of just these stricter enhanced rules of origin provisions? So it's important that at the outset, when these were imposed, the Congressional Budget Office in the US was estimating the following in terms of as a result of these more stringent requirements. They were predicting a decline in duty-free imports of motor vehicles and parts into the United States. They were predicting that that would be replaced either by domestic production or imports subject to duties because they were going to be meeting the RVC requirements, and that those duties were going to represent about $3 billion for the United States. No wonder the United States wanted that interpretation, right, in terms of the more stringent 75% RVC calculation. The USITC in the US simply said these provisions are going to translate into, of course, higher prices for vehicles in the United States and decreased vehicle consumption. Now, what was the reaction in the auto industry in Mexico, auto industry in general, because this is really a worldwide industry that has co-production in different parts of the world? So what was their reaction in terms of how this might impact them? So industry representatives and industry analysts were saying that instead of trying to create a North American product under the very, very stringent RBC calculations per the US interpretation, which was going to be very cumbersome, expensive, it was going to be more cost effective to simply opt to import the product under most favored nation status, which would give the product a 2.5% duty, meaning that that was preferable than the cost that was going to be imposed in trying to comply with the North American content. Now, what about the production shift expected to the US to try and comply with this? Well, we know that direct investment, foreign, any kind of direct investment is quite anchored, it's quite rooted, and it can't just up and go, right? So you can't expect that to all of a sudden uproot itself and shift to the United States. However, the question remains, could over time, with the emphasis being over time, investment plans switch to favor higher US presence versus Mexico and Canada to maintain duty-free treatment and market access. And here I will switch to Spanish there, so please keep me in mind. So here our emphasis switches to what are the implications for Mexico. So here we're trying to now convey the importance of this industry in Mexico for both the US and world economies and ultimately the Mexican economy and the border region. So Mexico's automotive manufacturing industry is in essence the production that takes place in the country by US and other foreign vehicle and auto parts producers. Here's the list of companies under the US, you'll recognize them. Here are the Japanese companies that are represented, the German companies represented, South Korean, and France, although it had stepped away from Mexico for about 20 years, recently announced it's going to re-enter the country with an automotive manufacturing presence. So Mexico right now, because this industry has indeed been thriving and it's now actually the engine of growth for the Mexican economy, it's now Mexico, the second largest light vehicle producer in the world. There's the number of vehicles it produced in 2022, 10% growth in 2021. Third largest exporter of vehicles in the world. And there you have the numbers, 63.5 billion, 80% destined to the US market. So you can see where that market access being impeded by that stringent RBC requirement. I'm sorry, I'm out of time.
No, you're fine. That was Patricia, don't ignore
The
it.
phone, you just.
Perdón. You're gonna make me switch into Spanish. So 85% destined to the US market access to the US is very important. In the other category of vehicles, medium and heavy trucks, 7 billion, 95% destined to the US market. Mexico is now the fourth largest producer of auto parts in the world. It displaced Germany from that seat not long ago, and it's poised to unseat Japan as the third largest. In 2022, production of auto parts, 101.2 billion, exports almost 84 billion, 72% destined for the US, imports over $62 billion, and 55% almost from the US. So what I'm getting at here is that very tight, intimate relationship between US and Mexico in co-production and export-import relationships. Here's my trend line in new passenger vehicles and light trucks with the red line being Mexico, which has been increasing in importance, right? This is Mexico and Canada combined. So it kind of surpassed Canada in that role over time, and that's the world, the green one. But obviously the USMCA regional component of this trade is very important for the three countries. Here's US exports. This was US imports, US exports. I like to say that a lot of the trade that happens between the US and Mexico, it's in similar products, right? It's basically the same product at different stages of production, right? So you see also quite hefty numbers when it comes to US exports to these countries. Same for auto parts, as I talked about how important it's become in Mexico. And you can see the US imports from Mexico again trending up and being the largest component of the USMCA region. Now, just a little more on what it means for Mexico, this industry. Mexico's automotive manufacturing industry, as of last year, it now represents 3% of the country's GDP, up from under 2% in '95, nearly 17% of its manufacturing GDP, from under 10%, 95, and 95 has a significance. This is when NAFTA started, more or less, 94, 95. So now we're in USMCA territory. 22% of manufacturing employment, and more, I like to say almost 1 million workers in Mexico. Most of them in the auto parts industry, that second line. Regional distribution, here's the border part. So automotive manufacturers in Mexico are mostly concentrated in Mexico's northern border region. And in the central part of the Mexican Republic. I haven't read the names of those border states. Baja California, Sonora, Chihuahua, Coahuila, Nuevo León. Original equipment manufacturers, other parts in Mexico. Auto parts producers, predominantly also in some border states, the ones in red. I won't recite the names. And then heavy duty vehicle manufacturing plants, there's the border again, those states that I've highlighted in red. Of course, I'm not assuming that you know what this border looks like, but here it is. This is the dividing line between the US and Mexico. These are the states that I just kept mentioning. There's 6 states that border the US, the 4 US southern border states. So here's that map of automotive OEM assembly plants in Mexico. So it's quite prevalent throughout the country, but of course, very heavily represented in the northern border states. Here's the auto parts production in Mexico. 51% is taken care of by the northern border region. Those are the states that I've been mentioning. The rest is in that sort of central area. For the border economy, some highlights. So I've shown you the border states. Let me just give you some highlights. For the state of Chihuahua, and that's a state that I'm from in a way, because I'm from the Paso del Norte region, which includes Juárez, Chihuahua. So Chihuahua happens to be the largest automotive industry employer in Mexico. So we already said that it's quite huge in Mexico. The border is quite represented within that piece of the automotive industry. Well, Chihuahua is top in that border region. Juárez, that specific border community, is the top employer within the state via maquiladora manufacturing. And maquiladora manufacturing employment, by the way, is responsible for over 310,000 workers in the city of Juárez, 60% of the city's formal employment, 80% of its manufacturing employment. What I'm trying to get at is that as you narrow your focus to the border in terms of the importance of this automotive industry, it gets higher and higher and higher. So the implications of kind of displacing any of this industry and or maybe not having it thrive as it has been thriving is going to have a much bigger impact the more micro you go. The boom in 2022 in Juárez, there's not even enough workers to fill the positions that are opening up. The expectation is that 15,000 engineers will be needed in the next 5 years. Foxconn will double in size from 12. Foxconn is one of the largest electronics manufacturers in the world, will double from 12 to 25,000 employees. So it doesn't look like the industry is going away. However, the USMCA did kind of throw a wrench there in terms of what might happen to this investment. At the end of 2022, 4 new investments were announced. And I say at the end of 2022, shortly before that ruling came in, right? It was leaked in December 22, officially announced in January, right? So there was a little bit more certainty as to what was going to happen with the interpretation of the USMCA RVC content. So again, there you see heavy investment. They're not insignificant numbers for these communities in terms of the number of jobs generated. Coahuila, one of the other states, it's the largest producer of auto parts in Mexico. And again, just in late 2022, new investment in the production of systems for EVs by one of the top producers in that field. So what are the prospects for Mexico's automotive industry? So the ruling in favor of Mexico and Canada on USMCA RVC dispute consolidates Mexico's attractiveness for use in foreign auto and auto parts producers, provides certainty for long-term investment plans if the settlement is accepted by the US. I say that because the US, Canada, and Mexico have 45 days after January 10th to come to an agreement to see if the US is going to accept the ruling, and if not, Mexico and Canada can retaliate. So hopefully the US will come to terms with that, preserves the industry's clustering and growth within Mexico to include its northern border region. One potential new mega investment announced at the end of 2022 a week after the ruling on the USMCA rules of origin, the Tesla plant, a mega plant that's probably being contemplated for the state of Nuevo León, a border state. Parallel to all this is my final slide, there's the nearshoring trend that's favoring Mexico right now. So the pandemic, we know, along with geopolitical tensions between the US and China, exposed the supply chain vulnerabilities that exist when the US or world industry over depends on Asia for its product and subproducts, right? Nearshoring seeks to eliminate or reduce these vulnerabilities. Mexico surfaces as a natural candidate as a nearshoring investment destination to include its northern border region for the obvious geographical advantage. And I think with that, I'm concluding. I was really going fast, so hopefully I didn't go over time.
No, you didn't at all. Thank you.
So one
Okay.
thing I'd like to add just real quickly, so we get a couple minutes left, is remember that manufacturing automobile industry is considered a key industry in economic development. It has many forward and backward linkages. And you know, you're talking about your center versus peripheral. And this is a center industry, right? And so this is why it's also important for economic development, just not because of the number of jobs, but because of the linkages back and forth into the economy. You know, 15,000 engineers, those people have to be educated. That means a higher education investment that'll have to go on that will then have knock-on effects for other higher education type of educational activities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, I'm done.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I wonder what the revolution in e-vehicles is going to mean for this industry.
Yeah, wow.
That's another question. Let's not get into that now.
That's another paper and another question.
Yeah. Okay. Tamar, our final paper. Tamar Agheli is going to talk about the post-conflict normalization through trade agreement, preferential trade agreements, and here it's the Israel, Jordan, Egypt, and the QIZ the quiz initiative. Okay.
Hi, everyone. So I think the order of the presentations was really very, very good because I did something wrong here. Okay. I'm sorry, I don't seem to see my, oh, there, I got it. Okay. I don't know, the thing is not working.
Your slides are not moving?
It's not moving when I do that, right? It's up there, but it's not moving here.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Okay, I'll just do the one by one.
Okay.
Okay, so,
I don't know if I helped.
sorry, it's stuck again. I'm gonna close it down.
Start it up again.
Start it up again. Okay.
There you go.
Okay, so the qualified industrial zones, essentially I'm taking your question about how to design a trade agreement, but for an additional goal of normalizing relations in a post-conflict environment. So beyond the issue of trade and of economic interest, we can add the political focus. So I'm talking about two sets, Israel-Egypt and Israel-Jordan. Both of them areas of, in both sets, Israel and Jordan and Israel and Egypt both have peace treaties. Israel-Egypt as of 1979, Israel-Jordan as of 1994, but there is some instability in the political relations and significant economic disparity. So that's like the context for this trade agreement, which I will represent. This period of the post-conflict environment, it's a transitional period. It's viewed as a window of opportunity. Let's make the most of it. Let's try and really make the peace rather than only a diplomatic agreement, something that the people on the ground can actually feel. And that is the notion of interdependence through trade. And theoretically, I'm not going to go too deep into this, There are different views on this. On the one hand, binding commercial liberalism, let's all make money together and then we'll all be for peace and normalization, and we'll make friends, and this is the new Middle East, the sort of vision. And in a realistic view, maybe trade could emphasize power disparities, economic disparities, amplify conflicting interests, and asymmetric partnerships, as in our presentation before, do not always bring about the best of dialogue and relations. So there are different ways that we could look at this in political theory. And so there's really no consensus regarding how commerce and trade might affect conflict and peace. You can look at short-term and long-term, and as I said, I'm not going to get too deep into this. It's really unclear, is it even for those who focus on the value of trade in instilling peaceful relations, or normalized relations, is it just the essence, the existence of trade? Or maybe there are additional factors, for example, removal of protective barriers, fairness, democratic regimes, expectations, all sorts of combinations between them all. So just trade as an on-off, is there trade or isn't there trade, is not enough to explain whether relations are going to be improved. So, and I think that in different presentations that were today, even in this session, we saw that it doesn't always go only in one direction, in a positive direction. So what is the quiz? The quiz it's a contract of qualified industrial zones. And this is actually an amendment to the United States-Israel Free Trade Agreement area of 1985. And an interesting thing happened. In 1985, Israel and the United States signed a free trade agreement. And in 1994, Israel and Jordan signed a peace treaty. And yet there was no incentive for Israel and Jordan to manufacture together because the free trade agreement was limited to Israel. So this was sort of like an extension of the duty-free and quota-free that Israel from purely Israel to its borders with Israel, with Egypt, Jordan, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip, but significantly to designated border areas between Israel and its peace partners. So the United States essentially took an existing agreement from 1985 and said, okay, let's use this free trade agreement in order to embed peace in economics, in trade, and allow Israel's peace partners to enjoy the free trade agreement, not everywhere, but in designated border areas. And we'll see that this little bit was actually discarded from the start. So this was really a political, economic sort of mix, and it was intended as for its political benefit. It was proposed as a solution to a problem, as I said before. Anything cooperated between Israelis wanted to begin to manufacture in Jordan, and yet they would lose their free trade status. And that was in Jordan. In Egypt, it took a while. The peace treaty was in 1979. In 2004, Egypt was facing the phasing out of the multi-fiber agreement, which is a framework for textile export, which allowed also free trade from textile from Egypt to the United States. So Egypt was not interested in the quiz until 2004, even though its peace treaty was earlier in 1979. And for the United States, this was some alternative to signing a free trade agreement with with Israel's peace partners, but rather sort of giving them like a carrot. You want free trade with the United States? Fine, let's do it with Israel. Okay? So again, there were rules of origin. You did that for me. And it was supposed to have 35% to be of local content, 11.7% from Israel, 11.7% of an Arab partner, and the remainder from any combination of these partners. It was eventually lowered. Israeli content was considered expensive, especially for textile. So Israel found itself like exporting, I don't know, zippers or about cartons and things like that. And these things, the Jordan and Egypt could get for cheaper. So they pressured the United States and Israel to agree, and Israel agreed to lower its content to 8%. So it's Israel, and the value was to be achieved through many things, but essentially the quiz were located both in Jordan and in Egypt, not in Israel. And so the labor was essentially there. The motivations for the United States, the economic goals, as I said, were secondary to the political goal. In Israel, I would say also the economic goal, Jordan was not considered a huge economic partner, significant partner. I personally heard Jordanian business people very disappointed that the quiz is mostly textile. And they said, we don't want to be your third world partner. We want it let's do this in computer programs. Let's do this in a higher level. But this involved something that apparently the partners were not ready for. So for Israel, normalization through neighborly relations was also the major incentive rather than economic prospects. Of course, access to Arab markets and low-cost Arab labor, okay, low-cost relatively to Israel. Okay, in Israel, there's not a lot of textile production left in Israel, just like in many Western countries. And many of these, as you said, instead of going to Asia, let's move to Jordan. Okay, and as for Jordan and Egypt, they also had different diverse motivations. For Jordan, in 1996, it was implemented in Jordan, the quiz, and the motivation was immediate benefit to United States markets, again, free without tax, and the training, exposure to international standards, attraction of FDI, and for Egypt, as I said before, mainly the phasing out of the multi-fiber agreement, okay? As in addition to deepening and raising the level of industry, which I think both sides eventually were disappointed with, okay? Because the quiz remained mainly in textile and it did not pan out in the expectations for improving and elevating all these benefits. Okay, I'm analyzing a short period, 1994 to 2014, just to show you the comparison between Israel, Jordan, and Egypt in terms of unemployment or average monthly wage, and you can see that partnership. It's not clear. Okay, the partnership is very, very imbalanced in both cases, Israel, Jordan, and Israel, Egypt. Remember what we said before, it's not clear that in cases of deep asymmetry that all the benefits will be exactly as envisioned. So we'll go a little bit into each case for as much time as we have. In 1994, we signed the peace treaty and everyone had expectations that this is going to be the new Middle East and we're going to make a lot of money together and be great partners. In 1994, you can see the expectation and yet fear of maybe some sort of a dominance of Israel. The original intent, as I said before, according to the agreement, it should have been the quiz was to be located on border areas and for a purpose, in order so that people will meet each other crossing the border and there'll be people-to-people interaction, which will actually contribute to the political goal of the quiz. But in reality, the first quiz was in the city of Irbid, 32 kilometers from the border. And the joke says that when King Hussein went to the United States to lobby for this, he said, what's the difference between the border, Irbid and Washington, D.C. and the border in Washington, D.C., 32 kilometers is nothing. But actually 32 kilometers is the difference between Israelis and Jordanians meeting each other every day at the factory or not. And it turned out that Irbid was already an industrial, already an industrial center, and it just allowed immediate implementation, and the United States agreed, and that was it. There were hardly any border quiz from there on. And the interpersonal contact, I've spoken to ministers both in Jordan and in Israel. This is all done through fax. Now it's done through email. And there's very little, maybe a little QA, you know, as Israelis go to the qualified industrial zones and they sign something, but this is not a interpersonal, there's not a great interpersonal benefit here. In terms of the economic impact, there was. Okay, you can see that in the Jordan-Israel quiz, which were all in Jordan, all the quiz sites were in Jordan. You can see how exports, Jordanian Israeli exports grew, and Israel-Jordan exports grew also. And yet we can, okay, as you can see, from Jordan to Israel, the exports grow from 5 million, and here also significantly from Israel to Jordan in terms of value. And in terms of, the problem is that there was very little Jordan added value and very, very little labor. You can see this, look what happened. The quiz turned out to be alternative for Southeast Asian companies, and they invested heavily in the quiz, and they decided to bring their own laborers. So you can see that 75% of the quiz workers were not even Jordanian. Jordan allowed thousands of Asian workers to come and work in the quiz. So you can see that there was no possibility, there was no potential for person-to-person interaction, people-to-people interaction, because the people were not Jordanian, and this became dominated. Okay, so Jordanians made money on this. It was highly profitable, but there was none of the political potential was hardly any political potential was panned out. Okay, so Jordan obviously improved its deficit in its trade deficit, but it was a disappointment, and there was very, very little spillover into Jordanian industry in general, or into improved any Jordanian perception of Israel and interacting with Israel, and the legitimacy of Israel as a peace partner, as a trade partner. None of that panned out. Okay, and then in 2008, Jordan and the United States signed a free trade agreement, and that was the end of the quiz. Okay, because the minute Jordan had an alternative to export free trade to the United States without the quiz, there was no point in limiting itself to inside the quiz, and that was the end of that. Okay, so the policy, in terms of policy outcomes, there was very little trade diversification, industrial diversification. It was mostly for low-tech companies. There was wide disappointment with that. The Jordanian government strategy expanded. The Jordanians expanded. There were eventually 13 quiz sites, but there was very little. There was nothing about this in the news. There was no confrontation of anti-normalization campaigns within Jordan. So essentially, the Jordanian on the street did not know that all of this improved economic the export and the employment was due to Israel-Jordan cooperation, because the Israeli content was essentially hidden. And in terms of the relations today, this is how it remains: minimum political or civilian dialogue. There is significant cooperation, as I said before in the session just now, and there's no more quiz. But still, Jordan and Israel cooperate in many areas in a sort of hush-hush way. Jordan exports through Haifa since Syria, since the Syrian port is off the no possibility anymore. And the relations are are pretty stable, and they're sound in terms of the shared interests. But just like with the quiz pattern, no one internally within Jordan, people don't really know. Okay, in terms of Israel-Egypt relations, so So again, we have sort of like a cold peace since the 1979 relations, and the quiz was not interesting to Egypt until 2004 with the phasing out of the MFA. In 2004, the quiz was urgently implemented in order to save the textile industry, which was losing its multi-fiber agreement, which was phasing out. And in Egypt, there were no border locations. I'll just say that between Israel and Egypt, there are no the border is not populated, so there's no possibility for textile industry on the border. And so right away, the quiz was focused in the existing cities in Egypt, very far from Israel. So again, very little potential for Israel-Egyptian dialogue through the quiz. And the quiz was, for Egypt, it served many interests, but it was also criticized because maybe with the phasing out of the multi-fiber agreement, we should have seen some structural economic reform instead of just running to the quiz to let's continue with the textile through the quiz instead of trying to see how we can actually elevate Egyptian industry to a stronger basis. So the Egypt-Israel quiz, again, many hundreds of thousands of jobs, mostly in textile, foreign investment. It does improve, obviously, the textile export, and yet very little diversification and general disappointment with any spillover potential into the economic. Okay, in terms of the impact on trade, you can see it does have an impact on Israel-Egypt trade. And there is maybe some positive. You can see that there are economic relationships, trade relationships, which are stemmed through the quiz. But again, if you would go to a quiz site in Egypt, you would not see Israel-Egypt flags. It looks like a regular industrial site. It you would work there and you wouldn't know that your job is based on this special trade agreement that has Israel in the picture. Okay, so and there is again, just like in Egypt, there's a voiced opposition. Israel's input is considered expensive. And people see it as some sort of an exploitation. They don't understand that the Israeli market is just that much more expensive. So Israel is blamed as manipulating the quiz, even though its input is barely 8%. There's criticism that very few companies dominate the quiz, and it doesn't trickle down to the average person. And I'm almost finished. So in the context of the general picture of Israel-Egypt relations, there's very little interpersonal contact, as I said, very little visibility of Israel, and the quiz achievements are almost hidden from the public. So just to end this, in both cases, both Israel-Jordan and Israel-Egypt, we have a minimal realization of the potential of the quiz potential and obfuscation of its achievements. And then we have a loop, a vicious cycle. Okay, when we hide the Israeli-Egyptian, Israeli-Jordanian political goal, and you do have the achievements, but they're not politically announced. They're not announced as politically associated with any cooperation with Israel. So the fruits of peace of both Israel-Jordan and Israel-Egypt peace treaties are very disappointing to the public simply because they do not know about these projects. Okay, so as I said, and I think that should be enough. Okay, so I see it as sort of like money on the table, anticipated economic and political goals left unrealized. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we had four papers that in many ways interlinked. I mean, we're really talking about impacts of globalization, and it's not that straightforward at all. It seems to be a very, very disjointed process that keeps recreating asymmetries, and but at the same time also has certain potential for development. But there's always the problem of political context, cultural context that might be intervening. And so I think we have nice food for thought here. So open up the the panel here for any questions or any comments, both of those, from,
I'll start.
sure.
I might as well just start. So I was struck by the commonalities of our two papers.
Yes, I was too.
And if you look at the US-Mexico border region economic development, it dates back to the 1970s, the maquila industry, which had very strict rules on imports and exports and content. And you had sometimes it's called the inbound trade because you had to import the product from the United States and immediately export it after assembly. And it was based basically on assembly. And that slowly grew and then became NAFTA and now is USMCA. And we're talking a 50-year process and to get where we're at now, but now it's a key element in economic development in Mexico, key source of high-paying jobs in Mexico. But you have a lot more complication with your situation politically than we
I
face.
think the goals were different to begin with.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. So I have a follow-up question. So you said that has not been a media campaign or a kind of publicizing of the fact of what were these goals to begin with in order to embrace whatever fruits there are economically as part of the coming together in the peace process, right? So that's deliberate then.
No, of course.
They do not want to announce that because they want to keep that distance because
So there's public opposition.
the animosity is that strong.
That's right.
Okay.
And I would say what's disappointing is that how quickly Israel agreed to lower its input from 11 to 8%. That demonstrates to us how Israel did not see this as any economic potential for itself. It's like throwing some crumbs to its neighbors and saying, okay, let them enjoy the peace treaty, but our real business will do elsewhere. And I think that's also an issue, because if this would have been built up to something that was very, very profitable for Israel, then Israel would have maybe worked harder at making it visible and training and having this interpersonal potential fed out.
Very interesting.
I think it also illustrates the importance of backward and forward linkages in
Yes.
economy for economic development.
I would have a question to Malika about your work, because it's a region I know absolutely nothing about, but it's actually not that far away. And it's about the Kurdish, also the situation of the Kurdish populations, which in Turkey is politically very, very strained, especially with Mr. Erdogan as a president who has somehow an obsessive fear of Kurdistan, this idea of how is the interrelationship between Kurds on both sides of that border? Is it very restrictive, or is there a lot of interaction that you see happening between communities on both sides of the border, or does the border really kind of limit the kind of, let's say, maybe economic networks developing or social cultural networks?
And the Kurdish issue is a very complicated issue in the world. I think not just every nation state, but internationally it's very complicated, as you see in the news. But it's very depending which border we are talking about, because the Kurds mostly inhabitant in the 4 different nation states border area.
Mm-hmm.
So Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Turkey. And the majority of Kurds live in the Turkish part. But for me, for my field research, I concentrated on the between Iran and Turkey. And so it's really depending on the relation of Iran and Turkey. And at the same time, and the extent and degree of these 2 nation states incorporation into capitalist economy, meaning this is the very directly affect the how government policy affects the local societies living their territorial borders. So the place I am studying now, I think there is no, in the global economy, there is no the place without changing, thinking the capitalist economy incorporation all over the regions, but in the Middle East regions, always restricted. Of course, with very different political actors like the PKK and the political Kurdish movements. And even if the strict borders, of course, the lots of border movements happening, and like the border trade, smuggling, drug smuggling, things like that. But my point is to emphasizing on the transformation, the local societies, even if they live very, very close to each other because of the borders.
Yeah.
So it's, I think, inevitable to not being unchanged.
Maybe moving apart.
Sorry?
Moving apart from each other.
Moving apart, yeah, and they are changing because of the urbanization, schooling, and healthcare, instruction, and transport. The centralization of nation states is very strong, depending on the capital accumulation, concentration of capital accumulation, because the Turkish government and Iranian government has centralization of capital accumulation regarding the international trades. But the different thing is the government implementation inside. The Turkish side is more developed compared with Iran. So that's why the Kurds living in the Turkey changing very quickly. So that's the point. The process itself is very important, not just every nation state's implementation. The process of incorporation is very, very important, I think. And the outcomes of my field research, it's about to finish before New Year. So it shows me, even if they live very together, and they are very differentiate each other in terms of language, in terms of clothes, Kurdish clothes, and speaking Kurdish language in their daily lives. And on Iranian side, they speak Kurdish with third generation, but on the Turkish side, they don't, because maybe it prevents them to be integrated into system. And it doesn't mean the coercive forces, it's the manufacturing consent, thinking all nation states in the capitalist economy, I think. So that's the point I want to say.
And then I have one question for Silan. I mean, you guys make a very good point about the kind of trap that believing in this FDI-driven development represented for, let's say, Central European countries that are going through this post-socialist transformation, or maybe they assume too much that would come their way by just following certain rules. I don't want to paint it, it's not all bad, but what kind of strategies do you think, for example, a country like Hungary could implement to maybe reduce its level of dependency, for example, on the German manufacturing economy? The German, has which is exported a lot of that to Central Europe. What kind of strategies might be developed by the smaller countries like Hungary, like Slovakia, to kind of have a stronger endogenous input, maybe greater wealth? What do you think could be done?
Yes. I think the problem is the education and the weaknesses of the institution and the society, because the transition was bad. Privatization, sell the working socialist factories, and the collapse of the industry. So in this transition, we get the financial capital, and so now Viktor Orban is a very populous prime minister, and he has good aspects of this integration, but he speaks not this political language. You know, the border fence.
Yeah.
And the relations, we are too small,
Yeah.
and the borders are open. You can study in Western Europe, you can do business in Western Europe, while you remain in Hungary. For go to conference, I spent one and a half monthly page. So it's ridiculous, and they don't want to higher level education system. That is the problem, because they don't want to thinking persons, only these employers, low wages, factories, and they do 100% export with 97% of import. So the value added is very small, and I think Ukraine and Romania and other countries in the eastern or southern part of Europe do better this.
No, but I think that was a good point. So institutional development, education, your resource, your here develop.
Yeah.
And this is something that I think is probably has been neglected too much. Any points to be made? Questions? Very interesting stuff here.
I have one question for colleagues from the New Mexico State University. What do you think? Will any change because of climate change and this green transition? Because this globalization period is in the second step after the coronavirus, the pandemic period. Not a whole global system will be strength, regional integration will be strength, and maybe compete from the others, or
He's serious environmental, so
Yeah, it's environmental.
one of his areas.
Or environmental issues are sort of, but yeah, the answer to your question is, if you go to trade group shows, you go to business meeting with business people, and you're in those meetings, all you hear is reshoring, nearshoring, bringing things back from China, being more competitive with China. Because Mexico and China, if you look at when Mexico, because remember NAFTA was in place when China ascended to the world
Trade organization.
World Trade Organization, and WTO. And when they ascended the WTO, they then got most favored nation status, which is a weird name since every nation has that status. And that resulted in their ability to export to the United States dramatically increased. And you could see where China was exporting to the United States, Mexico's imports fell.
mm,
And where China was not exporting to the United States, Mexico maintained its same level of exports. Now, that's not as clear in the record now because both industries have evolved and they're not quite as, and so we don't know what Mexico would have been doing today without China. But Mexico looks at that experience, or at least the business people on the border look at that experience and they say, not it's time, we've got this chance now to exploit this nearshoring and capture back market share that we lost. But as Lucinda pointed out, and is obvious, foreign direct investment in general does not move that quickly. It can't move that quickly because you can't pick up a factory in China and put it on a ship and send it somewhere else very easily. Apple famously, the president of Apple, whose name escapes me right now, had dinner with Trump, and Trump said, well, now they've got these tariffs, how long is it going to take you to start manufacturing? Because remember, they had US imposed tariffs on China. How long is it going to take you to manufacture Apple iPhones in the United States? And he said, we will never manufacture Apple iPhones in the United States because of the supply chain issues. It will never happen. And it hasn't, and it won't. Yeah.
Also, just to your point, if you're talking about sort of the green angle of manufacturing, if that's where you were getting at.
This is green transition process in
Yes.
producing vehicles or with digitalization.
What's interesting is that there's an area in our region, the Santa Teresa, San Jeronimo region, Chihuahua, New Mexico, where there's this huge sort of tracts of land that are being contemplated to do a think outside the box and do a development and manufacturing, but with green standards, so to speak, and thereby attract the newer wave of industry that wants to contemplate those ways of manufacturing, but still have the advantages, the typical advantages that the other foreign direct investment has had. But now with these industrial parks that are set up with the green technologies and the green energy sources and whatnot. So that's being contemplated as an ambitious, and it's being contemplated ideally as a bi-national kind of a development. So we'll see if it happens. People think that it's too idyllic to happen, but it's on the minds of people. It's on the minds.
Good, if not, you're free to go.
Let's thank.
Should be some coffee downstairs or something. Some extra time, because we're very good on time. We're very disciplined.
Are your papers going to be available?
Okay.
Okay, and I can just Google. Okay.